All right, I am back here on the Just End the Suffering podcast, talking the Jets offseason, joined today by one of the contributors to Gangrene Nation. John Butchko is here. John, welcome. How are you?
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to be here, too. I'm a Jet fan myself. It's been an interesting offseason. I mean, it all started back in late January. They hired Robert Saleh to be the new head coach. What do you think when they made the hire of Saleh?
It's difficult to say because the coaching last year was so bad that I feel like I'd be happy with practically anybody. I really did not think much of Adam Gase, and that goes back to his days with Miami. I think Saleh has the potential to be a really great coach. If you've ever listened to him talk about leadership, this is just a guy who really understands how to build. There were some very impressive things he talked about in his introductory press conference about how the team needs to focus on everything, the smallest details in your preparation. Because how you prepare during the week impacts how you play on Sunday. And another thing he said that really impressed me was talking about how you need to relate to players. That was a big weakness with Adam Gase. And Saleh talked about how he views his job as putting players in the position to succeed so that they can go get a big contract when free agency comes, whether it's with the Jets or with another team. And sometimes that's something that's easy to forget, that players are motivated by, you have to understand how players are motivated. You have to understand that's kind of how you get through to them as a coach. So I think Saleh comes with a very impressive background. He did a very good job with the 49ers defense. And, I think this past year may have been more impressive than the year they went to the Super Bowl because of the performance of the unit despite a number of key injuries. So you never know how a guy's going to translate from coordinator to head coach. It's a big step up. Some guys are not able to do it, but I think there's a lot of reason for optimism about this hire.
Yeah, I think one thing that caught my attention from his press conference is something he's going to do that none of these coaches they brought in over the last 2 decades have, which is he's not going to basically run his offense or run his defense. He's going to actually be the coach of the whole team, let the coordinators do their jobs. I feel like that's a big upgrade from Adam Gase having his head buried in the play sheet for the whole game, or Rex Ryan or Todd Bowles being just locked down the defense.
It's one of those things I think you don't appreciate. Now, I think the Jets got caught in the trap when they hired Adam Gase because Sam Darnold was coming off his rookie year and Sean McVay had taken the NFL by storm. And I think there was this mistaken philosophy in the NFL that you had to hire a coach with an offensive background. Now, if you look across the great quarterbacks in the NFL, that's not necessarily true. A lot of the top quarterbacks in the NFL were developed under head coaches with a defensive background. Tom Brady with Bill Belichick in New England. Matt Ryan has had nothing but defensive coaches to this point in his career. Russell Wilson developed under Pete Carroll. You could go on. And you hit the nail on the head. You need somebody who's going to coach the entire team. Now, how does that impact the team? It's difficult to say until it actually happens. There was a game last year against the Raiders where the Jets were ahead in the last 10 seconds of the game. And defensive coordinator Greg Williams called an all-out blitz, which was a crazy call because they had a bunch of rookie corners out there, and one of them was a non-drafted free agent, Lamar Jackson, who got burned by Henry Ruggs for a game-losing touchdown. And Adam Gase apparently didn't even hear the call until it was too late. Now, if you're a head coach interested in both sides of the team, you're going to be very focused. You're going to say, "Wait a minute, we can't call this. Change the play call." It's just little things like that. It's like you said it perfectly. Rex Ryan had a lot of positive attributes, but one of the issues was that he never really understood what he wanted to do on the offensive side of the ball, and that's something that really held the team back in spite of his many positive qualities. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the fact Robert Saleh is willing to delegate to oversee the big picture. He's a guy who seems like he understands that you need to run the entire team when you're the head coach. You're responsible for everything that happens on the field, not just your side of the ball.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think this offseason was very important for Joe Douglas, who admitted himself last year. He said, I wasn't aggressive enough. We had holes to fill. He kind of took the cheap way out, just did short-term fills. And I think this offseason, feels like more typical of what he's going to do. What do you think of the Joe Douglas offseason year 2?
I like what the Jets did. I'll tell you why I like what the Jets did. Is the Jets, for years under Mike Tannenbaum and Mike McCagnon, now not so much under John Idzik, but they've made a bunch of splashy moves, but they haven't been necessarily players who fit what they needed. They weren't necessarily great fits for the system, and they weren't necessarily very cost effective. And a good example of that was 2 years ago when the Jets signed C.J. Mosley. Now, you cannot blame the Jets for Mosley only playing 2 games through his first 2 years. The Jets could not have foreseen him getting injured his first game with the team. And they could not have foreseen, what happened last year of C.J. Mosley opting out. But if you look at the contract they gave him in the spring of 2019, they paid him like he was one of the top defensive players in the NFL, which he's a very good player. He's not. But more to the point, you look at what the pressing areas of need were for the Jets at that point. They needed corners. They needed pass rushers. They needed to build an offensive line around Sam Darnold. And they neglected all of that for C.J. Mosley. So it felt like at many times in the past, the Jets have been looking to get attention in their offseason. I mean, the most notable example of that was probably in 2012 when they traded for Tim Tebow, a deal which, let's be honest, did not make a whole lot of sense even at the time. What I think Joe Douglas did was he did not make as many splashy moves. And I think that there's a portion of the fan base that's frustrated with that because I think it's true across the NFL landscape. Fans want to see their team very aggressive in the early stages of free agency. Now, Douglas made some aggressive moves early on. He gave out a big contract to Carl Lawson, and he gave out a decent-sized deal to Corey Davis. But these were both players who played premium positions and filled big needs. But they also made a lot of other deals that could turn into really good value deals. You look at Sheldon Rankins on the defensive line. There was a guy who looked like he was an ascending star with New Orleans, and then he got injured. And there was recently an article by Connor Orr where he spoke with Rankins, and Rankins talked about his last 2 years, how he struggled and how he's finally starting to feel healthy now. Just got him for a deal that wasn't that expensive. He could be a big bounce-back player for them. LaMarcus Joyner, who they signed, who's spent time with the Raiders and Rams organizations. He's played some slot corner, not been so great there. He's played safety, been very effective there. Jets are going to play him at the safety position. So they made a lot of other smaller moves. Vinny Curry, who's a quality situational pass rusher. You know, he's a part-time player, but he doesn't cost much, and he'll probably do a good job for the team. They've been more focused on filling their needs, and I think that they've made a number of deals that could turn into good value deals this offseason.
Yeah, they certainly have. I mean, I watched the great teams. I mean, the Ravens, the Steelers, the Packers. Seems like they're never big in free agency. They tend to fill through the draft, and I think Joe Douglas did a good job with that. But targeting specific areas, the defensive line specifically, you've watched a couple of the guys they brought in, like Carl Lawson, Vinny Curry, Sheldon Rankins. I mean, going into the offseason is not an area where most people say, oh, they're going to spend a ton of money here. But you look at the moves they've made. They made themselves a much more deeper unit up front, and they have finally a potentially true edge rusher for Carl Lawson. Some of they have not really had the trade John Abraham like 15 years ago.
Absolutely. It's amazing. And what's also amazing is the Jets really have not used an early draft pick at edge rusher since Vernon Golston. It's kind of surprising because you think they've had coaches who really focused on building a pass rush on defense between Rex Ryan and Todd Bowles. It just hasn't been an area that's addressed. And the other interesting thing is if you went into the offseason, the defensive line was probably the strongest unit on the team because you had Quinnen Williams, who looked like an ascending star near the end of his second season. You had some other role players, Foley Fatukasi, who's developed into a really quiet, and people don't realize this, he's developed into a really good nose tackle. John Franklin Myers, who was top 10 in pressures among interior defensive linemen. But they still needed more. They needed help on the edge. And as much as Sheldon Rankins was not really a guy who filled a need for them because they did have some quality interior defensive linemen, some quality defensive tackle types, one thing that was really good about this, it was just a really good value. I was talking about how he looked like a really high ascending young player, and they got him at. Sometimes you can't always look at it as we can only address positions where we are weak. Sometimes if you make a strength stronger, that's another valid way to improve your team. And if you look at the system Robert Saleh is putting in, a lot of it's based on the defensive line's ability to get to the quarterback. So I think that they've made a lot of positive progress in that area.
Another area where they've definitely gotten better is wide receiver, because last year Douglas admitted he whiffed this by letting Robbie Anderson walk, basically a one-year deal with Carolina, and signing Rashad Perriman. That did not work. This year they had two big guys in free agency. They had Corey Davis out to be potentially the number one guy based off his track record at the end of the contract with Tennessee, and they had Keelan Cole getting some depth, a kick return option. What do you think about the receiver moves?
I think they're both good. If you look at the deal they gave Corey Davis, it's not even a top 20 contract in terms of annual value. So, a lot of times you give out contracts early in free agency, and in order to attract the guy, you have to overpay. The Jets did not overpay for Corey Davis, and Davis just had a really good year in the Titan system, which is probably similar to the one Mike LaFleur, the new offensive coordinator, is going to install with the Jets. Will probably be doing a lot of the same things. As you mentioned last year, that they tried to buy low move on Rashad Perriman, and it really did not pan out. As you mentioned, Keelan Cole a solid addition. He'll be the fourth receiver unless the Jets make any other moves between now and the start of the year. Last year, one of the issues for the Jets at wide receiver was that they had injuries. All three of the starters spent time on the bench because they were hurt. So Cole gives them quality depth. And obviously, there's going to be a new quarterback. The Jets will probably draft somebody second overall. One of the issues with Sam Darnold was the Jets never gave him a capable enough group of wide receivers. That's not going to be the case this year. I think whoever the Jets draft, the second they step onto the field, they'll have a better group of receivers than Sam Darnold ever had.
Yeah, it's certainly a fair point, and I know they did a good job addressing their holes. Two things that sort of stuck out to me is that most fans going into the offseason said, they need a corner, they need guards. They have basically addressed neither in free agency. Are you surprised they basically ignored those two positions entirely?
I'm not surprised at guard because if you look at the market this year, Joe Thuney was really the only big name out there, and he ended up getting a big contract from the Kansas City Chiefs, around $16 million a year. Look, I mean, I think the Jets are moving in the right direction, but if the Chiefs are offering you that kind of money, you're going to choose the Chiefs over the Jets every time. So I think the offensive line has to be addressed through the draft. I think after you got past Thuney, there were not a lot of guys who were big upgrades there. Now, a corner, yeah, I'm surprised there hasn't been any activity yet. Although there's one caveat. There are still a couple decent players who are still on the market. You have Richard Sherman, who has played for Saleh and has expressed a lot of admiration for Saleh, and still is playing at a reasonably high level with San Francisco. I believe you still have Casey Hayward from the Chargers. You have Steven Nelson from the Steelers. So there's still an opportunity to do something at corner. But I'm surprised they haven't. I think that there were some deals out there to be had, and for whatever reason, maybe they're waiting for one of these other guys who's on the market right now. Maybe they're going to wait and see what they can do in the draft because they do have, in addition to the second overall pick, they have the 23rd pick from Seattle, which they got for Jamal Adams. And they have the second pick of the second round. So it's also possible you see an early draft pick at corner. But yeah, the group they have right now is not great. And then in addition to this, they don't have Brian Poole right now. Brian Poole remains unsigned, who was one of the top slot corners in the NFL. The Jets may not have had great corners, but they were set in the slot. Now, I mentioned a little earlier that they signed LaMarcus Joyner. They also have Marcus May and Ashton Davis, so maybe you'll see a three safety-based defense. But I think that there's pretty much no answers right now at corner. I think they're going to have to do something.
Yeah, they definitely are. I feel like also with them, something that's maybe floating around here, I think is an interesting theory, is that they may wait for some of these other players till after May 3rd. And I know they believe Joe Douglas of the Ravens was a big on the comp pick thing, and after May 3rd, signings don't count towards the comp pick. And I wonder if they're waiting and say, you know what, these guys are all similar. We'll wait till after May 3rd. That way it doesn't affect our formula.
Yeah, the only thing about that is the Jets have been so aggressive in free agency that I kind of feel like this is not a year where they're going to be able to get comp picks. So, it may just be a case where maybe somebody's coming off an injury and they want to see that they're healthy, or it may be maybe they're waiting until after the draft because they think these guys will still be out there after the draft if they can't get anybody with either pick 23 or 34.
Yeah, it's certainly fair. I think obviously the big elephant in the room was the quarterback situation. They trade Sam Darnold away. I think they did pretty well in the return. What do you think about how they're handling the quarterback read right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at Sam Darnold's performance to date, there's nothing that really justifies the return that they got. It's a tough spot because if you're looking at this objectively, they failed Sam Darnold as much as Sam Darnold failed them. And I still think that there's a possibility Sam Darnold could turn it around in another location. I think the economics play a role in it. The fact that Darnold is entering the last year where he's cost controlled plays a factor because you draft somebody this year, you kind of reset the clock. You get 4 years of a cost controlled quarterback. I also think the fact they have the second pick makes a difference here. Joe Douglas said it the other day when he spoke to the press, and I had the same thought, is that if the Jets were sitting maybe at 8th like Carolina was, and you're only getting like the 4th or 5th quarterback off the board, you might go back with Sam Darnold another year. But the fact that you have your choice of the non-Trevor Lawrence quarterbacks, because unless it's the shock of the century, Jacksonville's going to pick Lawrence first overall. But the fact you can get Zach Wilson if you like him, or Justin Fields if you like him, and it kind of seems like right now the Jets are leaning towards Wilson if you just kind of read between the lines. It's an attractive proposition where it may not be if you're sitting at 8 and you're getting, again, maybe the 4th or 5th best quarterback in this class.
Yeah, it's certainly fair. And Joe Douglas said the other day, it's a safe assumption they get quarterback at 2. So we're going to assume they get quarterback at 2. You mentioned those 2 other premium picks they have, 23 and 34. So do you think it's as simple as they take a guard at 1 and a corner at the other? Do you think there's anything else they might be looking at in those spots?
I think in an ideal world, that's what would happen. But, it's also possible that the guys who are there who would be good values are gone at that point. So I don't think it's a guarantee. And I also warn people about emphasizing needs too much in the draft, because when you're drafting somebody, you're trying to get a guy who's going to be with your team for 10 years. And a lot of rookies don't contribute on day one. This is the question I always ask when I try and put this into context. In 2007, did the Jets have a need at corner when they drafted Darrelle Revis? And the answer most people have is they don't know. Nobody remembers. Or in 2017, did the Jets have a big need at safety when they drafted Jamal Adams? Again, you probably don't remember. So it's not really that important when it comes to when you really evaluate whether it's a good pick or not. What you're trying to do is you're trying to add impact players. You're trying to add somebody who's going to help your team over the course of the next decade. So in an ideal world, need and value meet at one of these early picks. But I think sometimes there's too much of an emphasis on need, where a team should really focus on value, because you're trying to add somebody who's going to be an impact player for the long run. And at the end of the day, Jets were 2-14 last year. Even with all the cap space, even with all the improvements, even with all the draft picks, this is not going to be a fully built roster next year. No matter what happens in the draft, they're going to have some needs that are going to be unfilled. This is going to be a 2 to 3 year process to really rebuild this team. So, look, I'm certainly hoping one of the corners falls to them at 23 and, they get a good guard at 30. I think that's the ideal scenario, but I don't think they're going to be so caught up in position. I think, if you have to go into next year with a weakness at corner, so be it, if you can get a better player at one of those picks.
Yeah, I also think something that people are kind of ruling out here, which I don't think they should, is like, if the board doesn't fall how they like, I would not be shocked if Douglas shops 23 and tries to move back and pick up more picks to sort of boost their chances of getting more guys to help them out.
I agree with that, and that's just, it just goes back to what I said, is there's just so many needs on this roster. I mean, the good thing is the Jets, for once, actually have given themselves enough resources to really improve this team quite a bit next year. But you have to remember, they can win 5 more games, which would be a heck of an improvement, and it'd still only be a 7-win team. They have a long way to go, so I agree with you. I think that certainly could be a possibility.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, they still have a lot of work to do. I mean, they had such a short role on the roster because of all the wasted draft picks over the 2010s, but I feel they've definitely gotten better from a 2-win team last season. Like, if you were to say right now, not obviously before the draft, like, how much better do you think they are right now compared to where they were at the end of the last season?
I think that they've improved. I mean, I think the defensive line is a big deal. They have a legitimate pass rush now, which they did not really have. I mean, you said it yourself. They have not had a legitimate pass rusher since John Abraham was here. So I think that will help quite a bit. You're always hesitant with a rookie quarterback, but I mean, Darnold was just not very good last year. I think that you should see some degree of improvement at quarterback, in part because I think the offensive system is going to be better. And there are some guys out there, you have Denzel Mims, who you're hoping will improve in year 2. Mekhi Becton, you're hoping he'll be more consistent. You're hoping Quinnen Williams grows after a strong second half of last year. So there's room for internal improvement as well. So, I think for Jets fans, maybe 6-7 wins should be a reasonable expectation. If they fall below that, you may start to wonder a little bit about Joe Douglas. You would love for this team to go out there and make the playoffs. And look, it's the NFL. Anything can happen. Sometimes the ball just bounces your way during the season. You don't suffer injuries. But I think a lot's going to have to go right for this to be a playoff team next year. What you should expect for a Jets fan, what you should demand as a Jets fan, is legitimate improvement. This should not be a team that's embarrassing like the team was in 2020. This should be a competitive football team on a week-to-week basis, and they should vastly improve that 2-win total from 2020.
Yeah, I think if you're a Jet fan, I think honestly, if you go from 2 wins to about 7 or 8, I think you're thrilled. And then your hope is that 2022, we're contending for the playoffs. I think that's what you're hoping for.
Absolutely. And, you'll have a quarterback entering his second year, and you have a lot of players. That's when it clicks. And, you'll have another draft class coming in. Salah will have his systems implemented. He'll have a better idea of what he wants from players. I think you're absolutely right. That seems like the right time frame to me.
All right, John Butchko from Gangrene Nation. Thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can people follow the Gangrene Nation on social media? What some of the stuff you guys are doing over there?
So if you go to Twitter at Gangrene Nation, that's our Twitter handle.
All right, John. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.